Hello, I'm the 10-minute English teacher. Let's get you exam ready. Today we're thinking about an Inspector Calls by JB Priestley, and I'm going to be providing you with a summary, quotes and analysis for Mrs Birling. Before we get going, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to aim higher than your target grade, like and subscribe so you can find me again to help you get exam ready. Okay, Mrs Birling. In front of you now are key moments involving the character. I'll walk you through them. So the play starts with the curtain rising, and in the stage notes we find out that Mrs Birling is Mr Birling's social superior and is a rather cold woman. Mr Birling makes a speech to celebrate Sheila, his daughter's engagement to Gerald Croft, and he speaks about his love for his daughter and their relationship, but then begins to speak about money and business. This embarrasses Mrs Birling, who has to remind Mr Birling that it isn't the time or place to be talking about business. Gerald Croft is spoken to by the inspector about his relationship with the girl, and Mrs Birling is very keen to keep that information away from Sheila and wants her to be excused. That would compromise what their relationship and engagement might mean for the family. Later on in the play, the inspector speaks to Mrs Birling and we find out about her involvement in the girl's downfall. She works for a charity committee and has refused the girl assistance because she introduced herself as Mrs Birling, which she found to be gross impertinence. And as well as that, she refuses to accept the fact that a girl of her class would refuse stolen money. We find out the girl's pregnant, and Mrs Birling suggests that the father should be made a public example of. And there's a wonderful bit of dramatic irony there because we're aware that it's Eric that is the father, because the inspector has previously mentioned that he will be wanting to speak to Eric at some point before the night draws to a close. Eric then speaks about his relationship with the girl and the fact that he had stolen money for her. Mrs Birling is genuinely upset about the stolen money, and she's also apologetic to Eric for not having helped the girl, but doesn't show any remorse or feeling towards the girl who has died. Towards the end of the play, there's a clear division between the older characters, Mr and Mrs Birling, and their children, Eric and Sheila. Eric and Sheila are taking responsibility, but Mr and Mrs Birling are very much the same people that they were at the beginning of the play. And that takes us to quotes to know. So at the beginning in the stage notes, we find out that she is a rather cold woman. So Mrs Birling, while she might be quite negative and miserable, she's rather unhappy in the life that she has, regardless of how privileged she seems. She is her husband's social superior. So we find out very early on that she is somebody who might have ambitions to join the upper classes, which of course would become possible if the relationship with Gerald and Sheila leads to a business relationship for the Birlings and the Crofts. Mrs Birling says to Sheila, men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time on their business. So her marriage to Mr Birling hasn't been particularly fulfilling, and actually Sheila's life with Gerald is probably going to mirror the life that her mother has. She then says to the inspector, when Eric's drinking is questioned, she says he's only a boy. And this is interesting because she sees her children, who are adults, simply as children and infantilises them and speaks about them in such terms. Doesn't expect them to take any responsibility for their actions. She says to the inspector that he has a peculiar and offensive manner. Manners are something that she insists on, and that's ironic because actually she's not a particularly moral person. She says, you know, of course, my husband was Lord Mayor. Again, it's in a similar way to Mr Birling, trying to use her social status to influence the inspector, of course to no avail. And then says it would be better if Sheila didn't hear this story at all when Gerald is speaking about his relationship with the girl. She wants to protect Sheila from hearing that confession, possibly because she doesn't want it to compromise what that might mean for their family and their prospects. Sheila says impertinent is such a silly word, which reflects the idea that there's a change in Sheila and that they're seeing the world in very different ways. There's a very big contrast in the way that Sheila approaches the inspector and Mrs Birling does. She talks about the gross impertinence of the girl who had introduced herself as Mrs Birling, which again is ironic because, in fact, she has claim to the Birling family in many respects, given that she is pregnant at that point to Eric's child. She talks about the idea of the father needing to confess in public his responsibility, which is ironic because if he was to, that would completely compromise Mr Birling's chances of a knighthood. And she also talks about girls of that sort. Earlier on in the play, she also talks about girls of that class. So she's very much a judgmental person who believes that people that are of lower social classes are not of her social airs and graces and don't deserve the same respect that she does. And Sheila says, "Now mother, don't you see?" when the identity of the father is about to be revealed. Sheila's got insight that Mrs Birling doesn't have. And towards the end, she says, "From the way you children talk, you might be wanting to help him instead of us." So that's after the inspector's left. Mrs Birling is still very much of the us and them mentality, whereas Sheila is starting to realise that actually we are part of a whole community, which is what the inspector had alluded to on his way out of the door after speaking to the family. And that takes us to analysis. So here are some conceptual ideas for you to take away, something that you could put into your response if you're aiming to be heading towards that level 6 outcome. So, metaphorical blindness. Mrs Birling is a static character, which means she doesn't change, and she's metaphorically blind to the impact that her attitude and privilege has on others. While Sheila comes to realise the impact her actions have had, Mrs Birling fails to take responsibility. "Now, mother, don't you see?" asks Sheila when it's obvious Eric is to be the father. There's a clear contrast made between the two characters. We've also got the motif of manners in the play. So manners are a motif, and Mrs Birling insists on good manners, but what she really insists on is the right to speak down to those less privileged than her. She speaks about the impertinence of Eva Smith as well as the impertinence of the inspector. Her insistence on good manners and respect for etiquette doesn't make her a moral person when we look below the surface, which Priestley wanted to encourage us to do in regards to society. And we also have Mrs Birling as a symbol for the upper middle classes. So Mrs Birling has married Mr Birling, expecting him perhaps to rise to her family's social rank, which is why Priestley wants us to know immediately that she is her husband's social superior. Mrs Birling's social role is as wife to Mr Birling, and her life is driven by her ambitions to better the social standing of the family at any cost. Mrs Birling seems keen to keep Sheila away from Gerald's confession in case of it threatening the engagement and the opportunities it may bring to the Birlings. Okay, if you want to take it further, watch the video again and mute the sound. Can you talk your way through the key moments in time with the yellow marker? If you get stuck, unmute and you can hear the explanation from me. Also, can you explain the significance of each key quotation and the context of them instead of me in time with them changing? Okay, check out the other videos on my channel. I'll continue to add content. Feel free to ask something you'd like to see me cover in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share, and keep revising.